Hazel Combs, at 69 years old, had believed that a lifetime of quiet devotion carried its own quiet reward. She had given 34 years to a single third-grade classroom in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina, 34 years of September mornings and May afternoons and reading circles and multiplication tables and small hands reaching up to be called on, 34 years of teaching other people's children to read while raising her own son in the slim hours between the last school bell and the first star over the ridgeline. She had given 38 years to her husband Dale Combs, a carpenter with gentle hands and sawdust permanently ground into the creases of his knuckles. She had stood beside Dale through lean winters and hospital bills and the slow, steady building of a life that never asked for much and never received much more than it asked for. Then, 14 months before this story begins, Dale's heart had failed him on a Tuesday morning in December while he was carrying firewood up the porch steps, and before the frost had finished melting on his grave marker in the Combs Hollow Cemetery. Their son Troy had driven up from Charlotte in a leased BMW and begun explaining, in the patient, condescending voice of a man who sells things for a living, why Hazel could no longer manage the family homestead alone. Hazel wasn't just pressured, she was managed, maneuvered, and methodically stripped of everything she and Dale had built together. As if 38 years of marriage and a lifetime of mountain roots could be folded into a real estate transaction and filed underhandled. While Troy and his wife Misty calculated the value of the 40-acre Combs family property, the homestead, the timber rights, the long view of the Blue Ridge that Misty had already photographed for her renovation mood board, Hazel received a single faded deed to the shuttered Combs General Store on Old Highway 19, a building that had been boarded up since 1996 and hadn't seen a customer since Emmett Combs, Dale's father, had locked the front door for the last time and driven home to die. "Take it," Troy had said, tossing the deed onto the kitchen table with a sound like something being discarded. "It's condemned. It's a money pit. The roof leaks. Nobody's been inside since Grandpa Emmett died." But what Troy and Misty didn't know, what they were too impatient, too modern, and too far removed from the quiet ways of mountain people to understand, was that beneath that 1912 oak sales counter, hidden inside a false floor that old Emmett had built with his own hands in the 1970s, lay 50 years of carefully preserved Appalachian folk art worth more than $2 million, a set of highway easement documents worth nearly $4 million more, and a handwritten letter addressed to whoever finds this. Though Emmett had known, with the quiet certainty of a man who understood his own family, exactly who would care enough to look, Emmett Combs had been building that hidden treasury for half a century, trading store credit for masterpieces, filing paperwork that no one else bothered to read, waiting for the day when the one person who loved the store as much as he did would most need to know that she had never been given something worthless. If you've ever felt the world push you aside because of your age, if you've been told by the people who should have protected you that your life was too small to matter anymore, if you've sat alone in a quiet kitchen believing everything was over when it was actually just beginning, this story is for you. Subscribe now. Because what Hazel Combs found when she pried up that false floor behind the counter of a condemned general store will make you believe that love builds fortresses in the places no one thinks to look. Welcome to the last chapter. Hazel Combs was 69 years old when the son she had raised on biscuits and patience decided she was a problem to be solved. Not cruelly, Troy did not do cruel. He did efficient. He did concerned. He did, "I'm just trying to help you, Mom," in a voice that carried the same measured warmth as a thermostat set to 62 degrees, warm enough to claim comfort, cold enough that you never stopped shivering. He arrived on weekends without calling first, his BMW crunching up the gravel drive like an announcement, Misty beside him with her designer sunglasses and her phone already out, framing shots of the homestead's wide front porch and the chestnut beams Dale had hand-hewn the summer they married. "This place has such bones," Misty would say, running her fingers along the mantel as if she were already pricing the renovation. "The light in here is incredible. You could get $1,200 a night in peak leaf season." Dale had been gone 14 months, a massive heart attack on the porch steps, the firewood scattered across the boards, his big carpenter's hands still curled around a split log of white oak when the neighbor found him. Hazel had been at the grocery store in town. She came home to an ambulance in the driveway and a silence so complete it seemed to have a texture, like the air itself had thickened, like the mountains had leaned in closer and were holding their breath. That silence would not last. Within 6 weeks of the funeral, Troy had begun what he called the conversation. It was never one conversation, it was a campaign. It arrived in phone calls that started with, "How are you doing, Mom?" and ended with, "Have you thought about what we discussed?" It arrived in printed spreadsheets left on her kitchen table showing the property tax burden, the insurance premiums, the cost of heating a 4-bedroom mountain house for one person. It arrived in Misty's bright voice saying, "We just don't want you to be lonely up here, Miss Hazel," while her eyes measured the square footage of the dining room. What Hazel didn't realize yet was that Troy's spreadsheets never once mentioned the general store, because Troy had already dismissed it as worthless, and that single act of contempt would cost him more than he could calculate. The pressure worked the way water works on stone, not all at once, not with a single blow, but slowly, persistently, until the shape of the thing had changed, and you couldn't quite remember what it had looked like before. Hazel signed the homestead over to Troy on a gray September morning in the office of an attorney in Asheville named Mr. Hardin, a quiet man with rimless glasses who asked her twice, in a careful voice, whether she was certain. She was not certain. She was tired. There is a difference, but it is a difference that the law does not always recognize. Troy got the house. Troy got the 40 acres. Troy got the timber rights and the mountain views and the hand-hewn chestnut beams. In exchange, Hazel was allowed, Troy's word, allowed, as if he were granting a favor rather than acknowledging a right, to keep the deed to the shuttered Combs General Store on Old Highway 19. Troy laughed when she asked for it. He actually laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement, the first honest sound she had heard from him in months. "The store? Mom, the store is condemned. County's had a notice on it for 3 years. The roof's caved in on one side. There's probably black mold from floor to ceiling. You'd spend more on demolition than the land is worth." He shook his head and signed the transfer document with the heavy silver pen Misty had given him for Christmas. "But sure, take it. It's yours. Grandpa Emmett's folly." Misty covered her mouth with one manicured hand and made a small, polite sound that was not quite sympathy and not quite a laugh. Hazel folded her copy of the deed and placed it in her brown leather suitcase with the brass clasps, the same suitcase she had carried on her honeymoon to Myrtle Beach in 1987, the same suitcase she had packed when Dale was in the hospital for his back surgery in 2009, the same suitcase she was now packing because she had 30 days to vacate the only home she had known for 36 years. She did not cry in front of Troy. She had not cried in front of anyone since the funeral, and she did not intend to start now. She simply closed the brass clasps, thanked Mr. Harden for his time, and walked out of the office with the careful, patient grace of a woman who had spent 3 decades teaching 8-year-olds that dignity was something you carried with you, not something anyone could take. Patricia Neighbors, that was actually her last name, Neighbors, and she had been Hazel's next-door neighbor for 22 years, which was the kind of coincidence that only happened in small mountain towns. Helped Hazel move into the small rented cottage on Laurel Branch Road the following week. It was a clean 2-bedroom place with a tin roof and a gas stove, and it was not home. Patricia brought casseroles and sat at the kitchen table and said the things that good neighbors say. "You're going to be all right, Hazel. Dale would be proud of you. Troy doesn't know what he lost." And Hazel nodded and drank her tea and looked out the window at someone else's mountain view and felt the silence settle around her again, like snow. For 3 weeks after the move, she did very little. She cooked for one. She walked the half-mile loop around Laurel Branch in the mornings, her brown leather walking shoes crunching on the gravel, the thin gold chain with the tiny cross catching the cool autumn light at her collar. She answered her phone when her sister Margaret called from Knoxville, and she said the careful sentences newly dispossessed women are expected to say. "I'm fine. The cottage is nice. Troy means well." She did not say, "I can still feel the grain of Dale's chestnut beams under my palm." She did not say, "I dream about the homestead every night." She did not say, "I have been erased from my own life and I don't know how to write myself back in. If only Troy had known what was hidden inside that condemned store he'd laughed at across the attorney's table. He never would have let Hazel walk out with that deed, not in 1,000 years. She might have stayed in that quiet rented cottage for the rest of her days, walking the loop, drinking her tea, fading into the gentle anonymity that mountain widows sometimes accept like a second widowhood, if she had not found Dale's old metal toolbox while unpacking the last of the boxes from the homestead. It was a dented green toolbox with a rusty latch, the kind Dale had carried to every job site for 30 years. Inside were the expected things: a tape measure worn smooth at the 5-foot mark, a carpenter's pencil, a small level with a bubble that still floated true, and beneath the tools, tucked into the bottom tray in a small manila envelope, a photograph. Hazel sat on the edge of the bed and held the photograph in both hands. It showed Emmett Combs, Dale's father, standing behind the oak counter of the general store. Emmett was perhaps 60 in the photograph, a lean man in overalls and a flannel shirt, his white hair combed neatly, his eyes sharp and quiet, one hand resting on the counter's dark surface. Behind him, the shelves were still full. Canned goods and seed packets and bolts of fabric and mason jars of penny candy. The potbelly stove glowed in the background. It was a picture of a place that was alive, a place that breathed, a place where people had come to trade and talk and linger over cold bottles of Coca-Cola on hot August afternoons. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in Dale's careful handwriting, the same square letters he had used to label every drawer and shelf in his workshop, were 2 sentences. "Dad always said the store was the real treasure. I never understood what he meant. Maybe you will." Hazel sat very still. Outside the cottage window, a crow called once from the ridge line and was answered by another, farther away. The morning light through the glass fell across the photograph and across her hands and across the thin gold chain at her throat. Dale's voice, patient and plain, speaking to her from beyond the grave in the only language he had ever fully trusted, the language of things that were built to last. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the small kitchen table in the rented cottage until the stars faded over the blue ridge, turning the photograph over and over in her steady hands. By the time the first gray light crept down the mountainside, she had made a decision. She would drive to the store, she would go inside, and she would look for whatever it was that Emmett had believed was worth finding. The Combs General Store stood on Old Highway 19 at the foot of a long hollow where the road bent south toward the Tennessee line. Hazel had not been inside in nearly 20 years. She had driven past it 100 times. Everyone in the county had. And each time the building had looked a little more defeated, a little more consumed by the vines, a little more like something the mountain was slowly swallowing back into itself. But she had never stopped. Stopping would have meant remembering, and remembering Emmett's store meant remembering Dale as a boy, which meant remembering Dale, which meant confronting the vast and specific shape of what she had lost. She parked on the gravel lot at 8:30 on a Thursday morning in late October. The air was cold and clean, the kind of air that tasted like creek water and wood smoke and the last breath of summer dying in the high hollows. A light mist hung in the trees. The mountains rose in layers of blue and gray behind the store, and the autumn hardwoods, sugar maples gone to crimson, hickories turned to gold, dogwoods deep in burgundy, framed the old building like a painting that someone had hung and then forgotten to take down. The store looked worse than she had imagined. The gray clapboard had warped and split in places. The 4 hand-hewn chestnut posts that held up the front porch were wrapped so thick in kudzu and morning glory that they looked like green pillars holding up nothing. The plywood over the windows had darkened to the color of charcoal. The faded hand-painted sign, Combs General Store, established 1912, hung from one rusted chain, swaying in the morning breeze. The other chain long since snapped. The tin roof was streaked with rust the color of dried blood, and in one place near the back a section had buckled inward, letting in 15 years of rain and snow and fallen leaves. But the door was still there. The old plank door that Emmett had hung himself in 1958, the year he took over the store from his own father. It was swollen and gray, but the hinges held, and the padlock, a heavy brass Yale that Hazel recognized because Dale had bought it at the hardware store in town the year Emmett died, was still intact. She had the key. It had been on Emmett's key ring, which Dale had kept in the top drawer of his desk at home, and which Hazel had placed in her suitcase the day she packed. She had not known why she kept it. She had not asked herself. Some things in grief are done by instinct, the way a bird builds a nest without being taught the architecture. The lock turned with a gritty click that echoed in the still morning air. She pushed the door inward. It groaned on its hinges, and a breath of air came out to meet her. Old wood, cedar shavings, the musty sweetness of aged fabric, dust and time, and the faintest trace of tobacco from the tin that Emmett had kept behind the counter 40 years ago. It smelled like memory. It smelled like something that had been waiting. What she didn't know yet was that someone else had been inside this building very recently, and not with good intentions. Hazel stepped across the threshold and into the dim interior of the Combs General Store. The wide pine floorboards creaked under her brown leather walking shoes, each step releasing a small puff of dust that rose and hung in the amber light slanting through the cracked shutters. The pot-belly cast-iron stove sat in the center of the room, cold and silent, its pipe disappearing into the pressed tin ceiling overhead. The wooden shelves ran along both walls, empty now, except for a few forgotten mason jars clouded with age, and a single tin of saddle soap that had been there since Ronald Reagan was president. The post office window, a small barred opening in the back wall where Emmett had sorted mail for the Hollow's 30-odd families, was shuttered and dark. Behind it, she could just make out the shape of the old roll-top desk where Emmett had done his accounts. And there, running the full length of the back wall, was the counter. The original 1912 oak sales counter, built by Emmett's father from timber, cut on the family's own land. 8 feet long, 3 feet deep, the surface worn to a satiny smoothness by 80 years of hands and elbows and brown paper bags and the sliding of coins and bills. Even under the dust, even in the dim light, the oak had a warmth to it, a richness, as though the wood itself remembered every transaction, every conversation, every child who had pressed their face against the glass candy case at its far end and pointed at the peppermint sticks. Hazel set her suitcase down beside the stove and began to clean. She did not know what she was looking for. She only knew that Dale's note had said the store was the real treasure, and that Emmett, quiet, shrewd, patient Emmett, had never said anything he didn't mean. She swept the floor. With a broom she found, leaning in the corner, she wiped down the counter with a rag from her suitcase. She opened the cracked shutters one by one, letting in the autumn light, letting the store breathe for the first time in decades. It was while she was sweeping behind the counter that she noticed the boot prints, fresh boot prints, in the dust. Large, heavy treads, not her own small walking shoes, tracking from the front door along the east wall to the post office window and back again. Someone had been inside this building within the last few weeks. The prints were sharp-edged, not softened by settling dust, and they led to the post office window and stopped, as if whoever had come in had been looking for something specific or checking on something, and then left. Hazel's heart quickened. She followed the prints to the post office window and found, on the narrow ledge beneath the brass bars, a clipboard. It was a county inspection form, the kind the building department used for condemnation assessments. The date was 3 weeks ago. The inspector's name was printed at the top, and at the bottom, under requesting party, in the neat block letters of an official form, was a name she knew, Troy Combs. Troy had filed for emergency demolition. He wanted the store razed. The form listed imminent structural failure and public safety hazard as grounds, and it recommended expedited demolition within 60 days. 60 days from 3 weeks ago meant Hazel had roughly 5 weeks before the county sent a crew to tear the building down. She stood in the amber light behind the counter, holding the clipboard, and for the first time since Dale's death, she felt something other than grief. She felt anger, not the hot, explosive kind, the cold kind, the kind that settles into the bones of mountain women and stays there like bedrock. Troy didn't just want the homestead. He wanted everything. He wanted the store demolished so he could sell the cleared lot to a developer, fold it into whatever scheme he and Misty were building on the ashes of 3 generations of Combs family life. That clipboard changed everything. Hazel set it down on the counter and looked at the store with new eyes. If Troy wanted this building destroyed so badly, then maybe there was something here worth saving. The answer was closer than she thought. She returned to her sweeping, but now she swept with purpose. She swept every corner, every baseboard, every inch of the wide pine floor. She moved the potbelly stove's ash bucket. She opened the shutters wider. and when she reached the section of floor directly behind the oak counter, the section closest to the wall, where Emmett would have stood for 38 years measuring fabric and weighing nails and counting change, she felt it, a seam, not a natural seam between floorboards, but a cut, a deliberate, careful cut, running in a rectangle roughly 4 feet by 6 feet, the edges so precise they could only have been made by a man who knew his way around a saw. The boards had been cut, lifted, and reset so perfectly that unless you were on your hands and knees with your face 6 inches from the floor, you would never see the lines. But Hazel had spent 34 years reading the handwriting of 8-year-olds. She knew how to find the faint marks that others missed. She knelt. She worked her fingers into the seam. She pulled. The false floor came up with a groan of wood against wood, releasing a breath of cedar and cool earth that rushed up from the darkness below. Beneath the boards was a cavity roughly 3 feet deep, lined with cedar planks. Emmett's work. Hazel recognized the joinery, and inside the cavity, arranged with the care of a museum curator, were wooden crates, 6 of them, sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth, each one labeled in Emmett's careful block handwriting on a strip of masking tape. Oaks decoys, Sisk quilts, meters pottery, carved figures, documents, letter. Hazel sat back on her heels and stared into the cavity. The amber light through the shutters fell across the crates and across her hands and across the thin gold chain at her throat. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in the empty store, a steady rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the creaking of the floorboards and the distant sound of a crow calling from the ridgeline. She lifted the first crate from the cavity and set it on the counter. She broke the wax seal. She folded back the oilcloth. Inside, nested in cotton batting and cedar shavings, was a hand-carved bird decoy, a pintail drake, roughly 14 inches long. The painted feather detail so precise that for a moment Hazel thought it might be real. She turned it over in her hands. On the bottom, carved in small, neat letters, W. Oaks, 1971, Willard Oaks. She knew the name. Everyone in the Blue Ridge knew the name. Willard Oaks had been a master carver from over in Madison County, a man whose decoys were now in the Smithsonian and the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Museum. He had died in 1989, and his work had been rising in value ever since. There were 11 decoys in the first crate, 11 Willard Oaks originals, each one wrapped individually in cotton batting, each one dated and signed, each one in flawless condition. Hazel unwrapped them one by one with the slow, careful hands of a woman who understood that she was holding something irreplaceable, a canvas-back hen, a wood duck drake in full breeding plumage, a great blue heron with its neck curved in that distinctive S shape. Each carving was a miracle of patience and observation, the work of a man who had spent his life watching birds and translating what he saw into wood. "Oh, Emmett," she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken aloud in the store, and it hung in the dusty air like a prayer. The second crate held quilts, hand-pieced quilts by Beulah Sisk, the legendary quilter from Yancey County whose work Hazel had seen once at the Folk Art Center on the Blue Ridge Parkway and had never forgotten. Each quilt was folded between sheets of acid-free tissue paper. Emmett had done his research, and each one was a masterwork of color and geometry, a double wedding ring in deep jewel tones, a lone star in crimson and gold, a log cabin in shades of indigo and cream. There were 8 quilts. Hazel unfolded the first one and held it up to the light from the shutters, and the colors blazed against the amber air, and she understood that she was looking at something that belonged in a museum. Something that Beulah Sisk had traded to Emmett Combs for store credit and a bolt of good cotton fabric 40 years ago, because that was how things worked in these mountains. You traded what you had for what you needed, and sometimes what you had was genius. The third crate held pottery, salt-glazed face jugs and pitchers and crocks by Lanier Meters, the folk potter from White County, Georgia, whose alkaline glazed stoneware was now collected by institutions across the country. Hazel counted 14 pieces, each one unique, each one bearing the distinctive grotesque face that Meters was famous for, bulging eyes, bared teeth, expressions that were simultaneously comic and unsettling. She handled each piece with the care of a woman holding a newborn, turning the heavy stoneware in her steady hands, feeling the grit of the glaze under her fingertips. He was trading store credit for art, Hazel said aloud, and the words sounded both obvious and miraculous. For 50 years, he was trading store credit for art. The fourth crate held additional carved figures, animals and saints and fiddlers by carvers whose names Hazel did not immediately recognize, but whose work radiated the same patient, self-taught mastery as the oak's decoys. The fifth crate was labeled Documents, and when Hazel opened it, her hands trembled so badly that she had to set the lid down and press her palms flat against the counter to steady herself. Inside the Documents crate, in a waterproof oilskin pouch, were the original 1912 incorporation papers for the Combs General Store. But clipped to the incorporation papers was a second set of documents that Hazel had to read 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. They were highway easement filings, dated 1974, signed by Emmett Combs. They established a perpetual commercial lease on 3.2 miles of old Highway 19 frontage, the stretch of road that ran directly in front of the store in both directions. Emmett had filed the easements quietly, paying the annual fees out of store revenue, renewing them every decade like clockwork. The paperwork was meticulous. The fees were current through 2028. Hazel did not know, sitting there in the amber light of the old store, what those easement rights were worth. But she knew enough about the world, 34 years of teaching had given her that, to understand that 3.2 miles of highway frontage in the path of a major road project was not something to be discarded. She had heard the talk at the post office and the grocery store for years. The state was planning the Blue Ridge Bypass, a new 4-lane highway that would cut through the mountains and relieve the traffic on the old 2-lane roads. She had heard the talk, and she had forgotten it, because it had not seemed to concern her. Now, sitting behind the counter of the Combs General Store, with Emmett's easement documents in her trembling hands, she understood that it concerned her very much. But this story does not end with documents and easements. What Hazel found in the 6th crate, the one labeled letter, is the part that proves Emmett Combs chose the right person to find his life's work. The 6th crate was the smallest. Inside was a single envelope, unsealed, made of heavy cream stationery. On the front, in Emmett's careful hand, were 5 words, "To whoever finds this first." Hazel opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. It was 2 pages long, written in the same neat block handwriting as the labels on the crates. It was dated March 15th, 1996, the same month Emmett had locked the store for the last time. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then you are the person I was waiting for. I have spent 50 years in this store, and I have spent 50 years collecting what these mountains produce. Not timber, not tobacco, not tourists, but art. The people who live in these hollows are artists. They don't call themselves that. They call themselves whittlers and quilters and potters. But I have watched their hands, and I know what I have seen. I have traded store credit for masterpieces. I have traded bolts of fabric for quilts that belong in a museum. I have traded canned goods for face jugs that will outlast every building in this county, and I have filed the highway papers because the road always comes back around. Hazel's tears fell onto the letter. She did not wipe them away. She let them fall. "I am writing this for whoever cares enough to look," Emmett continued. "If you are my son Dale, I love you, and I am sorry I was never good at saying so. If you are someone else, a grandchild, a stranger, a person I never met, then know this. These mountains are full of treasure that looks like junk to people who don't know how to see. The store was never about selling things. The store was about recognizing value where others saw none. That is my legacy. I leave it to whoever has the eyes." The letter was signed simply, Emmett. Hazel pressed the letter against her chest and closed her eyes. She sat there behind the counter of the Combs General Store, surrounded by Willard Oaks decoys and Beulah Sisk quilts and Lanier Meters pottery, and she understood something that rearranged every loss she had suffered in the past 14 months. Emmett had known. He had known that someday the family would fracture, that someday someone would try to tear the store down, that someday the only person left who cared would be the person everyone else had dismissed. He had written, "Whoever finds this first," but he had meant Hazel, the only one who'd care enough to look. She allowed herself 10 minutes of weeping. Then she dried her eyes on the sleeve of her dusty rose cardigan, put her tortoiseshell reading glasses back on her face, and called Patricia Neighbors. "Patricia," she said, "I need the name of that folk art appraiser you met at the gallery last spring. The woman from Chapel Hill." "Dr. Lucille Vance," Patricia said immediately. "She's at the Ackland Art Museum." "Hazel, what on earth have you found?" "I'll tell you when I understand it myself," Hazel said. "Can you come to the store?" Patricia arrived within the hour, and when she saw the crate spread open on the counter, she sat down on the floor beside the potbelly stove and put both hands over her mouth and did not speak for a full minute. "Hazel," she said finally. "Hazel, do you know what these are?" "I know who made them," Hazel said quietly. "I know Emmett collected them. I don't know what they're worth." "They're worth a fortune," Patricia said, and her voice was shaking. "The Oaks decoys alone. Hazel, there was one at auction last year in New York. A single pintail drake. It sold for $38,000. Hazel looked at the 11 decoys lined up on the counter. She looked at the quilts folded on the shelf. She looked at the 14 pieces of Meters pottery arranged on the floor. And she felt something shift inside her chest, a tectonic movement, the kind of feeling you get when you realize the ground you've been standing on is not what you thought it was. "Call Dr. Vance," she said. Patricia sat on the floor beside the potbelly stove for a long time, turning one of the face jugs in her hands. "Hazel," she said quietly, "Emmett used to let me buy cornmeal on credit when Jimmy was out of work. He never once asked me to pay it back. He just wrote it down in his ledger and said, 'We'll settle up when the road comes around.' I never knew what he meant by that. I thought it was just something old men say." "It wasn't," Hazel said. She was holding the great blue heron decoy, running her thumb along the carved feathers of its folded wing. The wood was smooth and warm, as if the bird were alive, as if 50 years underground had not dimmed the heat that Willard Oaks had pressed into it with his hands. He meant every word. Dr. Lucille Vance arrived 2 days later. She was a small, brisk woman of 60, with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and the careful, reverent hands of someone who had spent her life handling objects that other people had made with theirs. She drove up from Chapel Hill in a university vehicle loaded with packing materials and archival supplies, and when she walked into the Combs General Store and saw what was laid out on the counter, and the floor, and the shelves, she stopped in the doorway and took off her glasses and cleaned them and put them back on, as if she needed to verify that her eyes were not deceiving her. "Mrs. Combs," she said, "where did these come from?" Under the floor, Hazel said. My father-in-law collected them over 50 years. Dr. Vance moved through the collection like a woman walking through a cathedral. She handled each decoy with cotton-gloved hands, turning it slowly, examining the paint and the carving and the signature on the bottom. She unfolded each quilt and held it to the light, studying the stitching, the fabric, the pattern. She lifted each piece of pottery and felt the glaze and the weight and the shape of the handles. And with each piece, her expression changed, from professional interest to astonishment, to something that Hazel could only describe as awe. The oak's decoys, Doctor, Vance said, pulling out a small notebook. 11 pieces, all signed, all dated. Condition is remarkable. Your father-in-law stored these perfectly. The cedar-lined cavity, the cotton batting, the climate control of being underground. These are better preserved than pieces I've seen in museum storage. Conservative estimate, 15 to 40,000 per decoy. Total for the decoy collection, 220 to 440,000. The Sisk quilts, she continued, moving to the shelf. 8 hand-pieced originals. Mrs. Combs, there are only 43 documented Beulah Sisk quilts in existence. You have 8 of them. These are museum pieces, 8 to 25,000 each. Total, 64 to 200,000. The meters pottery, 14 pieces of documented Lanier meters work. Face jugs, alkaline glazed stoneware, 5 to 20,000 per piece. Total, 70 to 280,000. Doctor. Vance set down her notebook and looked at Hazel over the rim of her wire glasses. Mrs. Combs, I'll need to do a formal appraisal with documentation and provenance research, but my preliminary estimate for this collection, the decoys, the quilts, the pottery, and the additional carved figures, is between $1.8 and $2.4 million. Let's say $2.1 million as a working figure. Hazel sat down on the wooden crate behind the counter. Her steady hands, the hands that had graded 10,000 papers and held 100 crying children and folded her husband's shirts for 38 years, lay flat on her corduroy skirt. She looked at the decoys lined up on the counter. She looked at the quilts blazing with color on the shelf. She looked at the face jugs grinning their ancient grins from the floor. $2.1 million. Emmett's 50 years of store credit and quiet genius and patient eyes translated at last into a number the world could understand. There's more, Hazel said, and she pulled the oilskin pouch of highway documents from the 5th crate and laid them on the counter. Dr. Vance was not an attorney, but she knew enough to recognize what she was looking at. Mrs. Combs, she said slowly, these are perpetual commercial easement filings on 3.2 miles of state highway frontage. If the Blue Ridge bypass goes through this corridor, and I believe the DOT announced the route last year, these easement rights could be worth millions in condemnation proceedings alone. How many millions? Hazel asked. Dr. Vance walked to the shuttered post office window and looked at the locked roll-top desk behind it. May I? She asked. Hazel nodded. Dr. Vance tried the desk. It was locked. Hazel remembered the small brass key she had found in Dale's drawer months ago. The key she had dropped into her suitcase without knowing why. She opened the suitcase, found the key, and handed it to Dr. Vance. The lock turned with a brass click that echoed in the quiet store. The roll-top slid open, revealing cubby holes stuffed with yellowed receipts, a leather-bound account ledger, and a thick manila envelope marked Highway, NCDOT, Combs in Emmett's block handwriting. Dr. Vance opened the envelope and spread its contents across the desk. Hazel stood at her shoulder. The cicadas outside hummed their long electric note. The smell of cedar shavings drifted up from the open cavity behind the counter. Dust motes turned slowly in the amber light, as patient as the documents themselves. You need an attorney, Doctor, Vance said, but I've seen comparable cases. 3 to 5 million, depending on the route alignment and the state's offer." She paused. "Mrs. Combs, your father-in-law was either very lucky or very shrewd." "He was a man who paid attention," Hazel said. "That's the same thing in these mountains." The attorney's name was Helen Pace, and she had an office in Asheville and a reputation for handling land cases with the same quiet ferocity that Hazel recognized in herself. Helen reviewed the easement documents over 3 days. She called the NCDOT. She called a land use specialist in Raleigh. And on the following Monday, she called Hazel and said, in a voice that carried the careful excitement of a woman who had just found a very large diamond in a very unlikely place, "Mrs. Combs, the easement rights are valid, current, and directly in the path of the Blue Ridge bypass. The DOT has already begun preliminary condemnation proceedings on parcels in this corridor. Your father-in-law's filings give you a perpetual commercial lease on the most valuable 3.2-mile stretch of the entire route. My preliminary valuation is $3.8 million. Hazel was sitting at the counter of the general store when she received the call. She had been coming to the store every day now, cleaning, cataloging, sitting in the amber light with Emmett's letter in her lap. She heard the number, 3.8 million, and she closed her eyes and rested her forehead against the cool oak surface of the 1912 counter, and felt, for the first time in 14 months, that the ground beneath her was solid. "Mrs. Combs," Helen said, "are you there?" "I'm here," Hazel said. "I'm right here. 2.1 million in folk art, 3.8 million in highway easements, a total of $5.9 million, hidden beneath the false floor and inside the locked desk of a condemned general store that Troy Combs had laughed at across an attorney's table and called Grandpa Emmett's folly. Now remember, at that very moment, Troy had a demolition request pending with the county. 5 weeks to flatten the building. 5 weeks to destroy the evidence of Emmett's life's work. If Hazel had waited even one more month to look for whatever Dale's photograph was pointing her toward, the bulldozers would have arrived first. The meeting was arranged for the following Thursday in Helen Pace's Asheville conference room. Hazel arrived early, wearing her dusty rose cardigan and her cream blouse and her dark brown corduroy skirt, her brown leather suitcase with the brass clasps set on the floor beside her chair, her tortoise-shell reading glasses resting on the bridge of her nose. She sat quietly at one end of the long oak table. Helen sat beside her with 3 folders, the folk art appraisal, the easement valuation, and a legal brief outlining Hazel's rights as sole owner of the Combs General Store and all its contents. Troy arrived at 10:15, 18 minutes late, with Misty on his arm and a leather portfolio under one elbow. He was wearing his charcoal sport coat and his pale blue open-collar shirt and his polished brown loafers, and his heavy silver watch caught the light as he pulled out a chair across from Hazel and sat down with the expansive ease of a man who expected to be in charge. "All right, Mom," he said, setting his portfolio on the table. "I talked to the county. The demolition's on track. I'm going to handle the lot sale for you. I've already got a developer interested in the highway frontage. Won't be much, but it'll cover the demo costs and maybe leave you a little something." He opened the portfolio. "I brought the paperwork." Helen Pace cleared her throat. "Mr. Combs," she said, "before we proceed, I need to make you aware of several developments regarding the Combs General Store property." Troy looked at Helen. He looked at Hazel. He looked at the 3 folders on the table. Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm, not yet, but the first distant signal of a man who has walked into a room expecting one thing and is beginning to suspect another. "What developments?" he said. Helen opened the first folder. "Your mother recently discovered a collection of Appalachian folk art concealed beneath a false floor in the general store. The collection includes signed works by Willard Oakes, Beulah Sisk, and Lanier Meters. It has been appraised by Dr. Lucille Vance of the Ackland Art Museum at $2.1 million. Troy's face went very still. Misty's designer handbag slid off her arm and landed on the carpeted floor with a soft thud. Neither of them moved to pick it up. 2 point what? Troy said. 2.1 million, Helen repeated. She opened the second folder. Additionally, your mother discovered a set of perpetual commercial easement filings on 3.2 miles of old Highway 19 frontage. These filings were executed by your grandfather, Emmett Combs, in 1974 and have been maintained continuously since that date. The easement corridor falls directly in the path of the planned Blue Ridge bypass. The North Carolina Department of Transportation has confirmed the route alignment. My office has valued the easement rights at $3.8 million in condemnation proceedings. The color left Troy's face in stages, like water draining from a vessel. First, the flush of his habitual confidence, then the pink of casual authority, then the natural warmth of his skin. He was left with a gray pallor that made him look, for the first time since Hazel could remember, old. That's not possible, he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. The store is condemned. There's nothing in there. I had the county inspector. We're aware of your demolition request, Helen said evenly. Mrs. Combs found the county inspection clipboard inside the store. Your name is listed as the requesting party. I should note that filing for demolition of a property you do not own, without the owner's consent, raises significant legal questions. Troy's mouth opened and closed. Misty reached for his arm. He shook her off. The highway frontage, he said, and now his voice had a different quality. Not anger, not disbelief, but the cold recognition of a man who has just calculated what his own contempt has cost him. The 3.2 miles, that's the same corridor my development group has been. We've been planning a mixed-use project on that stretch for 2 years, Helen said. Yes. Your development plans depend on acquiring that highway frontage. The frontage belongs to your mother's store. It has belonged to your mother's store since 1974. Troy stared at Hazel. His jaw worked. His heavy silver watch ticked in the silence of the conference room. Misty's lash extensions fluttered. Neither of them spoke. You can't just... Troy pushed back from the table and stood. His chair hit the wall behind him. That store is condemned. I had it inspected. The county agreed with me. You can't just walk in there and claim. She didn't claim anything, Helen said calmly. She owns the store. She owns everything in it. And she owns the easement rights your grandfather filed 49 years ago. The law is straightforward, Mr. Combs. Troy turned to Misty. Misty was staring at the appraisal document, her lips moving slightly, as if she were trying to add the numbers in her head and kept arriving at a total she could not accept. Her cream cashmere wrap had slipped off one shoulder. Her designer sunglasses, pushed up on her head, had tilted sideways. For the first time since Hazel had known her, Misty looked like a woman who had run out of rooms to mentally remodel. 5.9 million, Misty whispered. Troy, $5.9 million. I know the number, Misty, Troy said through his teeth. Hazel looked at her son across the oak table. She looked at the boy she had nursed through ear infections and read to sleep and driven to baseball practice in a truck that smelled like sawdust and her own sweat. She looked at the man he had become, the charcoal sport coat and the leased BMW and the heavy silver watch and the voice that called her mom like it was a task on a to-do list. And she felt, beneath the anger and the grief and the vindication, a sorrow so deep it had no bottom, because this was her son, this was her child, and he had traded her life for a spreadsheet. "Troy," she said quietly. It was the first time she had spoken since he entered the room. "Your grandfather spent 50 years collecting art from people who didn't know what their work was worth. He traded them store credit and canned goods and bolts of fabric, and he saved what they made because he knew, Troy, that someday the world would catch up to what these mountains had always been producing. He filed those highway papers because he understood that the road always comes back around." She paused. She folded her steady hands on the table over the thin gold chain at her throat. "You laughed at the store," she said. "You called it condemned. You called it a money pit. You filed to have it demolished without telling me. And while you were doing that, I was on my knees behind the counter, lifting the floorboards your grandfather built, finding the treasure your father tried to tell you about, and you were too busy to hear." Troy said nothing. Misty said nothing. The conference room was silent except for the ticking of Troy's watch and the distant sound of traffic on the Asheville streets below. "I'm not going to punish you," Hazel said. "Emmett wouldn't have wanted that, and neither would Dale. But I am going to do what Emmett wanted. I'm going to take care of the art. I'm going to take care of the store. And I'm going to take care of the highway easement in a way that honors what your grandfather built. You can keep the homestead. I don't need it anymore." She picked up her brown leather suitcase with the brass clasps and stood. She looked at Helen Pace and nodded. She looked at Troy one more time, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the steady, patient gaze of a woman who had spent 34 years teaching children that actions have consequences, and that consequences are how we learn. Then she walked out of the conference room and into the autumn light of Asheville, and the door closed behind her with a sound like a chapter ending. The Combs General Store reopened the following spring. Not as a store, the days of penny candy and saddle soap were gone, but as the Emmett Combs Folk Art Museum and community gathering place. Hazel used a portion of the folk art proceeds to restore the building. A new tin roof, the clapboard repainted in its original cream, the chestnut porch posts cleared of kudzu and sealed with linseed oil, the pressed tin ceiling restored to its original beauty. The oak counter stayed exactly where it had been since 1912, but now it held a guest book and a small brass plaque that read, "In memory of Emmett Combs, 1918 to 2011. He traded store credit for masterpieces." The Willard Oaks decoys were displayed on turned wooden pedestals along the east wall, each one lit by a small brass lamp. The Beulah Sisk quilts hung on oak racks built by a local carpenter who had learned his trade from Dale Combs. The Lanier Meters pottery sat on deep shelves behind glass, the face jugs grinning their ancient grins at every visitor who walked through the door. Dr. Vance curated the collection and wrote a catalog that the Smithsonian requested 3 copies of. The highway easement settled for $3.8 million, as Helen Pace had predicted. The DOT acquired the rights through a condemnation proceeding that was, by all accounts, the most civil and well-documented land acquisition in the history of the Blue Ridge Bypass Project. Hazel donated a portion to the county library system and established the Emmett Combs Artisan Fellowship, a grant for young folk artists in western North Carolina to study and preserve traditional mountain crafts. Local artisans began displaying their work in the store on weekends. Wood carvers and quilters and potters from the hollows around Old Highway 19, people whose grandparents had traded with Emmett, people whose work carried the same quiet genius that Emmett had recognized half a century ago. Hazel served coffee from the potbelly stove and sat behind the oak counter and told the story of how Emmett had spent 50 years collecting what the mountains produced and how the road had come back around. Troy did not come to the opening. Misty did not come. The demolition request was withdrawn. The homestead, Hazel heard, was listed on a vacation rental platform within 2 months of the museum opening, and the reviews were mixed. The chestnut beams, Misty discovered, did not photograph as well as she had hoped. On a quiet October morning, 1 year after she had first driven to the store, with Dale's photograph in her suitcase and Emmett's key on her ring, Hazel unlocked the front door of the museum and stepped inside. The amber light through the restored windows fell across the oak counter and the decoys and the quilts and the face jugs and the wide pine floor where the false boards still showed their careful seams. She set her brown leather suitcase down beside the stove. She rested her steady hands on the counter, and she stood in the light and the silence and the smell of old wood and cedar shavings, and she understood that Emmett's letter had not been written for whoever finds this first. It had been written for her, the only one who'd care enough to look. The store breathed around her. The floorboards creaked. A crow called from the ridgeline. The morning light warmed the thin gold chain at her throat, and the tiny cross caught the sun, and the mountains rose in blue layers beyond the windows. And Hazel Combs, at 69 years old, stood in the center of a life that had finally recognized her worth, not because someone had given it to her, but because she had knelt down and found it herself. If you stayed with us through this entire journey, from a devastating eviction to an extraordinary discovery, from a condemned building to a $2 million folk art collection and a $3.8 million highway easement, from a son's contempt to a father-in-law's quiet, patient 50-year act of love, then you already know something about the kind of person this story was made for. If Hazel's story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever been underestimated because of your age, if you've been dismissed by the people who should have valued you most, if you've discovered that what looked like a devastating ending was actually the beginning of something far more extraordinary than you dared to imagine, then you understand why we tell these stories. Leave just one word in the comments describing the exact moment when you realized you were worth more than anyone around you had ever acknowledged. One word, that's all it takes. Because Hazel's story proves that patience creates legacies that greed can never touch, that justice may take its time, but it always knows the correct address, that you are never too old to kneel down on a dusty floor and discover that the treasure was always there, waiting for the one person who had the eyes to see it. And that the people who truly love us do not just say so. They build false floors and file highway papers and write letters addressed to whoever finds this first, knowing exactly who that person will be. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their worth isn't defined by who discarded them, but by who loved them enough to hide a fortune beneath the floorboards and wait. Somewhere tonight, a quiet woman in a quiet town is sitting in a rented cottage, looking at a deed she's been told is worthless, wondering if anyone remembers her name. Your word, your share, your small act of recognition might be the photograph she finds in a toolbox tomorrow morning. Welcome to the last chapter.